The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Thornfield Palace as Princess Catherine Rose stood by the tall windows of her private chambers. Her fingers traced the cold glass as she watched the gardeners tending to the rose garden below. The same roses that had bloomed on her wedding day 15 years ago now seemed to mock her with their perfect beauty. Prince Alexander Edward, heir to the throne of Eldoria, had left for his morning ride without saying goodbye. Again. The silence between them had grown so thick that even their children, Princess Emma and Prince James, had begun to notice. At breakfast, 10-year-old Emma had asked why Papa didn't sit with them anymore, and Catherine had forced a smile while her heart broke a little more. The royal marriage that had once been called a fairy tale was crumbling behind palace walls. The media still painted them as the perfect couple, but Catherine knew the truth. Late nights when Alexander would return from his royal duties, smelling of expensive perfume that wasn't hers. The way he avoided her touch, how his eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her. She remembered their courtship vividly. Alexander had been 25, charming and destined for greatness. Catherine, a duke's daughter, had been deemed suitable for a future king. Their romance had captured the nation's heart. The shy girl who blushed when he took her hand. The prince who wrote her poetry and brought her wildflowers from the palace grounds. Their wedding had been watched by millions worldwide. Catherine had walked down the ancient cathedral aisle in her grandmother's lace, feeling like the luckiest woman alive. Alexander had whispered, "You're beautiful," as she reached the altar, and she had believed their love could conquer anything. The early years had been magical. They had traveled together, worked on charitable causes, and welcomed their children with joy. Catherine had found her voice as a royal, championing education and mental health awareness. Alexander had been supportive, proud of his wife's growing confidence and public appeal. But somewhere along the way, duty had replaced passion. Royal obligations had pulled them in different directions. Alexander spent months abroad on diplomatic missions while Catherine managed royal engagements at home. They began living parallel lives, sharing a bed but not their dreams. The first crack had appeared 3 years ago when Catherine discovered a letter in Alexander's jacket pocket. It was from Lady Victoria Ashworth, a childhood friend who had recently divorced. The letter spoke of understanding and being there for him in ways that made Catherine's stomach turn. When she confronted Alexander, he had dismissed it as innocent friendship, but something in his eyes told a different story. Catherine had tried to fight for their marriage. She planned romantic dinners that Alexander missed due to urgent meetings. She bought beautiful dresses hoping to catch his attention, only to have him barely glance her way. She even suggested they take a second honeymoon, but the idea was brushed aside with talk of royal schedules and responsibilities. The loneliness was suffocating. Catherine found herself walking the palace corridors at night, feeling like a ghost in her own home. The servants treated her with respect but seemed to sense the tension. Even her loyal lady-in-waiting, Margaret, struggled to maintain the cheerful facade they presented to the world. Public appearances had become elaborate performances. They would smile and hold hands for photographers, playing the part of devoted spouses, but the moment they stepped away from the cameras, the distance returned. Catherine became an expert at hiding her pain behind perfectly applied makeup and designer gowns. The children were her saving grace. Emma, with her bright smile and curious nature, reminded Catherine of herself at that age. James, only 7 but already showing signs of his father's serious demeanor, needed his mother's warmth to balance his formal upbringing. Catherine threw herself into motherhood, determined to give her children the love and stability that seemed to be missing from other areas of her life. But even the children couldn't fill the emptiness that grew larger each day. Catherine began to question everything. Had Alexander ever truly loved her, or had she simply been the right choice for a future king? Had she lost herself somewhere in trying to be the perfect princess, the perfect wife, the perfect mother? The breaking point had come last month during the annual Harvest Festival. Catherine had watched from the royal box as Alexander laughed with Lady Victoria, who had somehow secured a prominent seat near the royal family. The easy familiarity between them, the way Alexander's face lit up when he spoke to her, was everything Catherine had been missing for years. That night, Catherine had lain awake staring at the ceiling while Alexander slept peacefully beside her. She realized that she felt more alone in their shared bed than she did when she was actually by herself. The man she had promised to love, honor, and cherish had become a stranger who happened to share her last name. Now, standing at her window, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't continue living a lie, pretending to be happy while dying inside. The fairy tale was over, and it was time to face reality. She thought about her children, about the monarchy, about the millions of people who believed in their love story. But mostly she thought about herself and the woman she had lost somewhere along the way. Catherine turned away from the window and walked to her writing desk. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out a piece of royal stationery. The words she was about to write would shake the foundation of everything she had built. But they were words that needed to be said. The silence had gone on long enough. As she began to write, tears fell onto the paper, but Catherine didn't stop. This was her truth, and finally she was ready to speak it. Alexander's boots echoed against the stable floor as he dismounted his favorite horse, Thunder. The morning ride had been longer than usual, as he found himself avoiding the palace and the conversation he knew was waiting for him. The letter Catherine had left on his pillow 3 days ago still burned in his jacket pocket, unread but heavily weighing on his mind. He handed Thunder's reins to the stable boy and made his way back toward the palace, each step feeling heavier than the last. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves were turning the same golden color as Catherine's hair when sunlight hit it just right. He shook his head, trying to dispel thoughts that had become both comfort and torment. The truth was, Alexander knew exactly what was in that letter. He had seen the pain in Catherine's eyes growing stronger each day, had felt the distance between them stretching like an ocean he no longer knew how to cross. Part of him had been waiting for this moment, dreading it but somehow relieved that the pretending might finally end. As he entered the palace through the garden doors, Alexander found himself remembering their first meeting at the Duke of Westbridge's summer gala. Catherine had been 22, fresh from university and completely uninterested in royal protocol. She had challenged him to a debate about environmental policy, her cheeks flushed with passion as she argued her points. He had fallen in love with her mind first, then her heart, then every beautiful detail of who she was. Those early years had been everything he had dreamed of. Catherine had brought laughter into the stuffy palace halls, had turned formal state dinners into genuine conversations, had made him feel like Alexander the man instead of just Alexander the future king. She had been his anchor in a world that often felt like performance art, but the weight of the crown had begun to change him. The endless meetings, the diplomatic pressures, the constant awareness that every decision would affect millions of lives, had slowly eaten away at the carefree prince Catherine had fallen in love with. He had started staying late at the office, taking longer trips, finding excuses to avoid the intimacy that once came so naturally to them. The worst part was Lady Victoria. Alexander's friendship with her had been innocent at first. Victoria understood the pressures of royal life, having grown up in aristocratic circles. She didn't expect him to be anyone other than who he was in that moment. Their conversations were easy, uncomplicated by the years of shared disappointments and unspoken resentments that had built up between him and Catherine. But somewhere along the way, those innocent conversations had become something more, not physical but emotional. Alexander found himself sharing things with Victoria that he couldn't share with his own wife. His fears about becoming king, his doubts about his ability to lead a nation, his growing sense of isolation within his own family. He hadn't meant for it to happen. Alexander still loved Catherine, perhaps more than he had ever loved anyone. But love, he had discovered, wasn't always enough to bridge the gap between two people who had grown in different directions. Catherine had blossomed into a confident, independent woman who no longer needed him to complete her. Meanwhile, he had become consumed by duties that pulled him further away from the man she had married. The children were caught in the middle, and that guilt ate at Alexander daily. Emma had her mother's intelligence and spirit, but lately, she had been asking difficult questions. Why did Daddy work so much? Why didn't Mummy and Daddy laugh together anymore? James, still young enough to accept the situation without question, nevertheless seemed to sense the tension, clinging more tightly to both parents as if afraid they might disappear. Alexander paused outside the breakfast room, hearing Catherine's gentle voice as she helped James with his mathematics homework. She was an incredible mother, patient and nurturing in ways that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her. But when their eyes met across the room these days, there was only sadness where once there had been joy. He thought about the state dinner last week, where they had played their roles perfectly. Catherine had been stunning in her emerald gown, gracious and charming with foreign dignitaries. Alexander had felt proud watching her command the room, but also distant, as if he were watching a stranger who happened to wear his wife's face. The media attention made everything worse. Every public appearance was scrutinized for signs of trouble. Photographers zoomed in on their clasped hands, looking for authenticity or performance. Royal correspondents analyzed their body language and facial expressions. The pressure to maintain the fairy tale narrative was crushing when the reality was so different. Alexander pulled Catherine's letter from his pocket, still sealed with her personal wax stamp. He knew that opening it would make their situation real in a way that couldn't be taken back, but continuing to avoid it felt cowardly, and Catherine deserved better than a coward for a husband. His private study was quiet, the morning light filtering through heavy curtains. Alexander sat at his desk, the same desk where he had written Catherine love letters during their courtship. The irony wasn't lost on him as he carefully broke the seal. Catherine's handwriting was as elegant as ever, but he could see tear stains on the paper. As he read her words, his heart broke a little more with each sentence. She wrote about feeling invisible, about loving him but no longer recognizing the man he had become. She wrote about their children and her fears for their happiness. Most painfully, she wrote about her realization that they both deserved the chance to find happiness again, even if it meant finding it apart. The letter didn't ask for a divorce immediately. Instead, Catherine suggested a trial separation, a chance for both of them to step back and evaluate what they truly wanted. She proposed that they tell the children together, that they work with the palace to manage the public relations crisis that would inevitably follow. Alexander set the letter down and stared out the window at the rose garden where Catherine spent so many of her mornings. He could see her there now, kneeling beside the late-blooming flowers, her face peaceful in a way it rarely was when they were in the same room. The rational part of his mind knew she was right. They had become actors in their own lives, playing roles that no longer fit. The love was still there, but it had been buried under years of obligation, miscommunication, and growing apart. Maybe separation would give them the space to remember who they were individually, and possibly who they could be together. But the thought of not seeing Emma and James every day, of not having Catherine's presence in the palace even as a distant comfort, felt overwhelming. This was his family, flawed and struggling, but still his. The idea of breaking it apart, even temporarily, went against every instinct he had. Alexander realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, feeling the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. Catherine was waiting for his response, had been waiting for 3 days with the kind of patient courage that had always amazed him. He picked up his pen and began to write his reply. The oak-paneled library felt suffocating as Catherine and Alexander sat across from each other for the first time in weeks to have an honest conversation. Between them lay both their letters, his response to her proposal written in the careful script she had once found romantic. Now it seemed formal, distant, like correspondence between diplomats rather than spouses. Margaret had taken the children to their grandmother's estate for the weekend, giving Catherine and Alexander the privacy they needed for this conversation. The absence of Emma's laughter and James's constant chatter made the palace feel like a mausoleum of their former happiness. Alexander spoke first, his voice careful and measured. "Your letter was honest. More honest than we've been with each other in years." He ran his fingers through his dark hair, a gesture Catherine remembered from their dating days when he was nervous. "I think you're right about the separation. We both need time to figure out who we are now." Catherine felt relief and heartbreak in equal measure. Part of her had hoped he would fight for their marriage, would suggest counseling or a romantic getaway, anything to show he still wanted to try. But the larger part of her knew this was the only path forward that honored both their dignity and their children's well-being. "The children," she said softly, "how do we tell them that their fairy tale parents are just ordinary people who lost their way?" Alexander's composure cracked slightly. "Emma already suspects something. She asked me yesterday why you cry in the garden sometimes." Catherine's hand flew to her throat. She thought she had been so careful to maintain her composure in front of the children. They spent the next hour working through logistics with the same efficiency they had once applied to planning state functions. Catherine would take a residence at Rosewood Manor, a smaller royal property about an hour from the palace. The children would split their time between both homes. Alexander would handle the necessary conversations with the king and queen, Catherine's parents, and the prime minister. The hardest part was discussing the media strategy. Their marriage had been public property for so long that their separation would be treated as a national crisis. The palace press secretary would need to craft a statement that was honest but not damaging to the monarchy's reputation. "We tell the truth," Catherine said firmly, "that we love and respect each other but have grown apart, that we remain committed to our children and our duties to the crown, that we ask for privacy during this difficult time." Alexander nodded. "Victoria will need to distance herself from me publicly. I know the media will try to make her the villain in this story, but she doesn't deserve that." The mention of Victoria created a moment of tension. Catherine had never confronted Alexander directly about the emotional affair, but they both knew it was part of what had brought them to this point. "I don't hate her," Catherine said quietly. "In some ways, I understand. You needed someone who could see you clearly, without all the history and disappointment. I wish it could have been me." Alexander's eyes filled with tears. "Catherine, I never meant for any of this to happen. I never stopped loving you. I just stopped knowing how to show it." For a moment, they were just two people who had once been everything to each other, now sitting in the wreckage of their shared dreams. Catherine reached across the table and took Alexander's hand. His fingers closed around hers with familiar warmth. "I know," she whispered. "I love you too. But loving someone and being able to make them happy aren't always the same thing." They held hands in silence, both remembering better times. Their first apartment together, late nights talking about their hopes for the future. The way Alexander had cried when Emma was born, how proud Catherine had felt watching him address Parliament for the first time as heir apparent. The weekend passed in a blur of practical arrangements and emotional preparation. Catherine packed her personal belongings, leaving behind most of the formal wear and jewelry that belonged to her role as future queen consort. She kept her engagement ring but removed her wedding band, placing it in the jewelry box with shaking hands. On Sunday evening, they sat the children down in the family sitting room, the same room where they had announced both pregnancies, where the family gathered for birthday celebrations and Christmas morning gift exchanges. Emma, intuitive as always, seemed to understand before they spoke. James, still young enough to focus on immediate concerns, wanted to know if he would still have his own bedroom in both houses and whether Thunder would still be available for his riding lessons. "Mummy and Daddy love each other very much," Alexander explained, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "But sometimes grown-ups need time apart to think about important things. You'll spend time with both of us, just in different places." Emma asked the question they had been dreading. "Are you getting divorced like Uncle George and Aunt Sarah?" Catherine knelt in front of her daughter, taking her small hands. "We don't know yet, sweetheart. Right now, we're just taking some time to figure things out. What I do know is that Daddy and I will always be your parents, and we will always love you more than anything in the world." James, practical as his father, asked, "Will there still be Christmas?" "Of course," Alexander assured him. "Christmas, birthdays, holidays, all of it. We'll just do things a little differently." That night, Catherine lay in their bedroom one last time, staring at the ceiling she had looked at every night for 15 years. Alexander was in his study, claiming he had work to finish, but she suspected he couldn't bear to share the bed with her when everything was about to change. She thought about their wedding night in this same room, how nervous and excited they had both been. They had stayed up talking until dawn, planning their future, making promises they had every intention of keeping. They couldn't have imagined then that love might not be enough to sustain what they were building. The morning came too quickly. Catherine's belongings were loaded into cars while she said goodbye to staff members who had become like family over the years. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, wept openly. Thomas, the butler who had served the royal family for 30 years, wished her happiness with the kind of dignity that made her proud to have been part of this institution. Alexander walked her to the car, the children beside them, trying to be brave. The press had gathered at the palace gates, sensing that something significant was happening. By evening, their carefully crafted statement would be released and the world would know that the fairy tale was ending. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander asked as Catherine's hand rested on the car door handle. She looked back at the palace that had been her home, at the man who had been her everything, at the life she was leaving behind. "No," she said honestly, "but I'm sure we can't keep pretending." As the car pulled away, Catherine didn't look back. She focused on the road ahead, leading to an uncertain but honest future. In the distance, she could hear the palace bells chiming the hour, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of whatever came next. 3 months had passed since Catherine moved to Rosewood Manor, and the world was still reeling from the royal separation. The media coverage had been relentless, with tabloids inventing dramatic stories about betrayal and heartbreak, while legitimate news sources struggled to respect the family's request for privacy. Catherine had stopped reading the headlines after the first week, but she knew the speculation continued. Rosewood Manor was smaller than the palace, but felt more like home than anywhere Catherine had lived in years. The staff was minimal, just a housekeeper, a gardener, and a security detail. For the first time since her marriage, Catherine could walk to the kitchen in her pajamas, eat breakfast without formal place settings, and spend entire afternoons reading without anyone scheduling her time. The children adjusted better than she had expected. Emma threw herself into her studies with renewed focus, perhaps finding comfort in controllable academic challenges when her family life felt uncertain. She video-called her father every evening, their conversations filled with discussions about history projects and her growing interest in environmental science. James missed his father more openly, sometimes crying at bedtime and asking when Daddy was coming home. Catherine would hold him and explain again that this was their new normal, that love didn't always look the same way, that families could be strong even when they lived in different places. Catherine's own adjustment was complicated. The loneliness she had felt while married to Alexander was different from the loneliness of separation. In the palace, she had felt invisible despite being surrounded by people. Here she felt genuinely alone, but somehow more herself than she had been in years. She began painting again, something she hadn't done since before Emma was born. Her art room overlooked the manor's small lake, and she spent hours capturing the changing light on water, the way autumn transformed the landscape, the simple beauty of ordinary moments. Her paintings were raw, emotional, nothing like the controlled perfection expected of royal pursuits. Alexander visited every other weekend when the children stayed with him. Their interactions were polite but strained, both of them trying to navigate this new relationship. They were no longer spouses but weren't quite friends either. They were co-parents and former lovers trying to find a new way to exist in each other's orbit. During one of these visits, Alexander found Catherine in her art room. He stood quietly looking at her latest painting, a storm-swept landscape that somehow captured both turmoil and hope. "You're painting again," he observed. "I had forgotten how much I missed it," Catherine replied, not looking up from her canvas. "Funny how we forget pieces of ourselves." Alexander moved closer, studying the other paintings she had completed. They were beautiful, full of emotion and life. "These are incredible, Catherine. You should show them." She finally looked at him, surprised by the genuine admiration in his voice. "They're just therapy, really. A way to process everything that's happened." "They're more than that," Alexander insisted. "They're you. The you I fell in love with before royal protocol taught us both to hide our real selves." The comment hung in the air between them. Catherine set down her brush and really looked at her estranged husband. He looked tired, older than his 40 years. Being the sole public face of their marriage's failure was taking its toll. "How are you managing?" she asked softly. "The press, the family pressure, all of it?" Alexander sighed and sat in the window seat overlooking the lake. "Father thinks I should have handled this more quietly. Mother keeps asking if there's any chance for reconciliation. The Prime Minister is concerned about public opinion polls regarding the monarchy. And what do you think? I think I'm learning who I am without you, and it's terrifying and liberating at the same time." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think you were right about the separation. We both needed space to remember ourselves." Catherine joined him at the window. "Have you been seeing Victoria?" The question surprised them both. Catherine hadn't planned to ask it, but the words came out before she could stop them. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "We've talked, as friends. She's been dealing with her own media scrutiny because of all this. But no, we haven't. It wouldn't be appropriate while everything with us is still unresolved. Catherine nodded. She appreciated his honesty, even if the answer stung a little. What do you think the resolution looks like? I don't know, Alexander admitted. 6 months ago, I would have said divorce was impossible. The scandal, the impact on the monarchy, the children. But now, I wonder if staying married just for those reasons is more damaging than ending it with dignity. They watched their children playing by the lake, Emma teaching James to skip stones. The sight filled Catherine with both joy and sadness. They looked happy, adjusted, but she knew they carried the weight of their parents' broken marriage in small ways. They're resilient, Alexander said, following her gaze. Children shouldn't have to be, Catherine replied. They should be able to count on their parents to figure it out. Maybe we are figuring it out, just not in the way we expected. That evening, after Alexander had returned to the palace with the children for their week with him, Catherine called her sister Diana. They had always been close, but the royal marriage had created some distance between them. Diana lived a normal life with her husband and 3 children, working as a veterinarian in a small town where royal protocol didn't dictate daily routines. You sound different, Diana said after they had talked for an hour. Sadder but also lighter somehow. Catherine considered this. I feel more like myself than I have in years. But I also feel like I failed at the most important thing I've ever attempted. Marriage isn't just about not failing, Diana said gently. Sometimes it's about recognizing when 2 good people have grown into incompatible lives. That's not failure, Kat, that's just life. But we have children. We made promises. We're supposed to be an example for an entire nation. You have children who are learning that adults can make difficult decisions with love and respect. You made promises when you were different people living different lives. And maybe the example you're setting now is more valuable than the fairy tale everyone wanted you to maintain. After hanging up, Catherine walked through the manor's small rooms, touching surfaces that were becoming familiar. She thought about the woman who had walked down the cathedral aisle 15 years ago, so certain that love would be enough to overcome any challenge. That woman had been naive but not wrong to believe in love. She had just learned that love took many forms, and sometimes the most loving thing was letting go. In her bedroom that night, Catherine looked at her reflection in the mirror. She looked older, marked by the struggles of the past few years, but there was something in her eyes that had been missing for a long time. Authenticity. She was no longer performing the role of perfect princess. She was just Catherine, flawed and human and finally honest about both her strengths and her limitations. The future remained uncertain. She didn't know if she and Alexander would find their way back to each other, or if they would formalize their separation with divorce. She didn't know how the children would ultimately be affected by their parents' choices. She didn't know what her life would look like in 5 years or 10. But for the first time in years, she was okay with not knowing. The uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. And that shift in perspective felt like the beginning of healing. Catherine had been thinking about this for weeks. Scheduled time away from palace duties just for our family. No work calls during dinner. More honest communication with the staff about our needs. Maybe even some couples counseling, something we were too proud to try before. Alexander nodded slowly. And what about my relationship with my parents, with the institution? They're not going to understand why we needed to almost destroy our marriage to save it. Then we help them understand, Catherine said firmly. We show them that a strong marriage makes for stronger royals, not weaker ones. That authenticity serves the crown better than performance. They talked until the fire burned down to embers, making plans and discussing possibilities. By morning, they had decided to request a 6-month extension of their separation, not because they were moving toward divorce, but because they needed more time to solidify their new foundation before facing the pressures of palace life. The announcement surprised everyone. The media had been expecting either a reunion or divorce proceedings, not a continuation of the status quo. Royal correspondents struggled to explain to the public why the separated couple seemed to be growing closer while remaining officially apart. Catherine's mother called, confused and slightly disapproving. Darling, what are you doing? Either you're married or you're not. This indefinite separation is unseemly. We're being careful, Mother, Catherine explained patiently. We're making sure that if we reconcile, it's because we truly want to be together, not because it's expected or convenient. But what will people think? Catherine looked out the window at James building a snowman in the manor's garden, his cheeks red with cold and joy. I think people will understand that real love is worth fighting for, even when the fight looks different than expected. As winter deepened, their small family found its rhythm. Alexander continued his royal duties but scheduled them around family time. Catherine began exploring the possibility of a small art exhibition, her confidence in her work growing with Alexander's encouragement. The children thrived in the stability that came from parents who were genuinely happy to be together. The turning point came on Valentine's Day, a holiday they had dreaded for years because of the pressure to perform romantic happiness. This year, Alexander surprised Catherine not with expensive jewelry or elaborate gestures, but with a small canvas and new paints. "I thought you might want to capture this," he said, nodding toward the garden where Emma and James were having a snowball fight. Catherine kissed him softly, tasting snow and possibility on his lips. "I love you," she said simply. "Not the prince, not the future king. You, Alexander, the man who notices what makes me happy." "I love you too," he replied. "Catherine, the woman who sees beauty in difficult moments and teaches our children that love can grow and change and still be true." That evening, as they tucked the children into bed, Emma asked the question they had all been thinking. "Are we ready to go home to the palace?" Catherine and Alexander looked at each other, communicating in the silent language they had redeveloped over the past months. "What do you think?" Alexander asked the children. "Are we ready to take what we've learned here and use it to make the palace feel like home?" James, ever practical, asked, "Will there still be family dinners without servants?" "Every Sunday," Catherine promised. Emma considered this seriously. "Will you still paint, Mummy?" "Always," Catherine assured her. "And will you still ride thunder with me, Daddy?" James asked. "Every morning that I'm home," Alexander confirmed. Emma smiled. "Then I think we're ready." That night, Catherine painted by lamplight while Alexander read beside her, the children safely asleep upstairs. She was working on a family portrait, but not the formal, posed kind that hung in palace halls. This one captured a moment from earlier that day. The four of them by the fire, Emma reading aloud while James built with blocks, and she and Alexander simply enjoyed being together. It was real, imperfect, and beautiful, like their marriage had become. The return to Thornfield Palace in March felt like arriving at a foreign country, even though it had been Catherine's home for 15 years. The grand hallways seemed excessive after the intimate spaces of Rosewood Manor, and the formal protocols felt stifling after months of casual family life. But this time, Catherine and Alexander were prepared. They had spent weeks planning how to maintain their newfound authenticity within the constraints of royal life. Their first act was to reorganize their living quarters, creating private family spaces where formality gave way to comfort. The staff, initially uncertain how to treat the returning couple, quickly adapted to the new dynamic. Catherine and Alexander's relationship was clearly different, more relaxed but also more intentional. They held hands naturally rather than for cameras, spoke to each other with genuine affection rather than polite courtesy. The children's adjustment surprised everyone. Emma and James, who had once seemed overwhelmed by palace life, now moved through the grand rooms with confidence. The months at Rosewood Manor had taught them that their parents' love was stable regardless of location, and that security allowed them to embrace rather than hide from their royal heritage. The first major test came during the annual Spring Garden Party, a formal event attended by diplomats, celebrities, and members of Parliament. Catherine wore a new dress, one she had chosen herself rather than having selected by stylists. And Alexander had written his own speech, rather than delivering remarks crafted by palace communication staff. The media noticed the difference immediately. Photographs captured genuine smiles and natural interactions. Royal correspondents commented on the couple's apparent renewal. Though they still didn't fully understand what had happened during the separation, Lady Victoria attended the event with her new partner, a kind-hearted banker who seemed genuinely devoted to her. When she approached Catherine and Alexander during the reception, the moment everyone had been anticipating finally arrived. "Catherine," Victoria said gracefully, "you look radiant. And Alexander, thank you for the wedding invitation. Henry and I are honored to be included." Catherine smiled genuinely. "Congratulations on your engagement, Victoria. We're happy for you both. Alexander nodded in agreement. Victoria, I hope you know how grateful I am for your friendship during a difficult time, and how happy I am that you found love with Henry. The gracious exchange surprised onlookers who had expected drama or tension. Instead, they witnessed three adults who had navigated a complicated situation with maturity and mutual respect. Later that evening, as Catherine and Alexander prepared for bed in their newly shared bedroom, they reflected on how far they had come. I was terrified to see Victoria tonight, Catherine admitted as she brushed her hair. But when I did, I felt nothing. No jealousy, no anger, just genuine happiness for her. The past doesn't have the same power over us, Alexander observed. We're not trying to recreate what we had before or compete with what might have been. We're just building something new. The months that followed established their new normal. Alexander limited his international travel, involving Catherine more in his remaining duties so they could work as partners rather than living parallel lives. Catherine's art exhibition opened to critical acclaim, with all proceeds benefiting children's charities. The exhibition's success gave Catherine a new platform and confidence. She began speaking publicly about the importance of authenticity, about the courage required to rebuild rather than simply endure, about the value of choosing love daily rather than assuming it would sustain itself. Emma, now 11 and remarkably wise, became her mother's biggest supporter. She attended the exhibition opening and told reporters, "My mummy teaches us that it's okay to be sad sometimes, and it's okay to change. And it's okay to fight for the things that matter to you." James, 8 and still more interested in horses than art, nevertheless understood that his family was different now. Better. His night terrors, which had plagued him during the worst of his parents' marriage troubles, disappeared completely. The 1-year anniversary of their separation approached with media speculation about their plans. Catherine and Alexander had discussed this privately and decided to mark the date not with a public announcement, but with a private renewal of their vows. The ceremony took place at Rosewood Manor, with only their children, parents, and closest friends present. Catherine wore a simple blue dress, Alexander a navy suit he had owned for years. The vows they exchanged were nothing like the formal promises they had made 15 years earlier. "Catherine," Alexander said, his voice steady and sure, "I promise to choose you every day, not because I have to, but because I want to. I promise to see you clearly, to support your growth, and to never take your presence in my life for granted." Catherine's vows were equally heartfelt. "Alexander, I promise to love all of who you are, not just the parts that are easy to love. I promise to build a life with you that honors both our individual dreams and our shared hopes. I promise to keep choosing courage over comfort, truth over performance." Emma and James each read short poems they had written about their family's journey. Emma's focused on the strength it takes to rebuild something broken. James's was about how love can look different but still be love. The small gathering celebrated with dinner in the Manor's garden, the same space where Catherine had spent so many mornings learning to be herself again. As evening fell and guests departed, the family of 4 sat together by the lake, watching the sun set over water that reflected golden light. "Are we different now?" James asked, a question that had become something of a family tradition. "Yes," Catherine said, pulling him onto her lap. "We're more honest, more grateful, and more careful with each other's hearts." "Is different good?" Emma asked. Alexander answered, "Different is good when it means becoming more of who you're meant to be." 6 months later, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. The news surprised them both, as they hadn't been actively trying to expand their family. But sitting in the doctor's office, hearing their baby's heartbeat, they both felt the rightness of this unexpected gift. "A new beginning," Catherine whispered, Alexander's hand covering hers on her still flat stomach. "The best kind," he agreed. Their third child, a daughter they named Grace, was born the following spring at Rosewood Manor rather than in the traditional royal hospital. The birth marked a full circle moment, bringing new life into the space where their marriage had been reborn. As Catherine held Grace while Emma and James marveled at their tiny sister, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The fairy tale ending she had once imagined bore no resemblance to the reality they had built together. This was better than a fairy tale. It was real, hard-won, and completely their own. Alexander sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Catherine, his other hand resting gently on Grace's head. "What do you think?" he asked, using their family's traditional question. Catherine looked around at her husband, their children, and the room where they had learned to love each other again. Outside the window, the roses in the garden were blooming, marking another season of growth and renewal. "I think," she said softly, "we finally learned how to write our own story." The media would never fully understand what had happened during those crucial 18 months. The official narrative spoke of a temporary separation that led to reconciliation, but the deeper truth was more complex and more beautiful. Catherine and Alexander had learned that love wasn't something that happened to them or something they fell into. Love was something they created daily through choice, attention, and the courage to keep growing together even when growing apart seemed easier. Their marriage became a new kind of royal example, one that showed strength in vulnerability, wisdom in admitting mistakes, and hope in the possibility of beginning again. They never pretended the work was easy, or that love alone solved all problems. But they proved that sometimes the most powerful thing two people can do is refuse to settle for a love that no longer serves them, choosing instead to build something worthy of who they're becoming. And in a world obsessed with fairy tale endings, they offered something more valuable. A story of real people doing the hard work of loving each other well, one day at a time, for all their days to come. 6 months into their separation, an unexpected crisis brought Catherine and Alexander together in a way they hadn't experienced in years. James had been rushed to the hospital with appendicitis during his week at the palace, and Catherine received the call at 2 a.m. She drove through the empty streets with her heart pounding, every worst-case scenario running through her mind. When she arrived at the private hospital wing, she found Alexander pacing the waiting room, his hair disheveled, still wearing the clothes he had thrown on when the emergency began. "How is he?" she asked breathlessly. "Surgery went well," Alexander said, his relief evident. "The doctor says it was caught in time. He's awake and asking for both of us." They walked together to James's room, where their 7-year-old son lay connected to various monitors but smiling weakly when he saw them. "Mommy, Daddy said you were coming." Catherine kissed his forehead while Alexander squeezed his small hand. For the next 3 days, they took turns staying with James, sometimes overlapping their shifts and finding themselves talking more naturally than they had in months. On the second night, Catherine found Alexander asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside James's bed. She covered him with a blanket from the nurse's station, studying his face in the dim light. Sleep had erased the tension he usually carried, and he looked younger, more like the man she had married. When Alexander woke a few hours later, he found Catherine sketching in a notepad, capturing James sleeping peacefully. She had always been able to find beauty in difficult moments. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the blanket, for being here, and everything." Catherine looked up from her sketch. "He's our son. There's nowhere else I would be." "I know, but the way you've handled all of this, the separation, the media attention, putting the children first. I haven't made it easy, and you've been graceful through all of it." "I haven't felt graceful," Catherine admitted. "Most days I feel like I'm barely keeping it together." "You always were stronger than you knew," Alexander said. "I think I forgot to tell you that." "I forgot to tell you a lot of things." The conversation was interrupted by James stirring, but something had shifted between them. Not toward reconciliation necessarily, but toward a deeper understanding of who they had become, both apart and together. When James was released from the hospital, both parents stayed at Rosewood Manor to help with his recovery. Alexander took a rare week off from royal duties, claiming family emergency, which was entirely true. Emma, initially worried about having both parents in the same house again, relaxed when she saw that they were working together naturally, rather than forcing interaction. During James's naps, Catherine and Alexander found themselves talking honestly for the first time since their separation. They discussed their individual growth, their fears for the children, and their evolving understanding of what their marriage had been and what it might become. "I've been thinking about what Diana said," Catherine mentioned during one of these conversations. They were sitting in the manor's small library, the afternoon sun streaming through tall windows. "Diana, my sister, she said that sometimes love means recognizing when two good people have grown into incompatible lives." Catherine paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I've been wondering if we really are incompatible, or if we just learned to be incompatible because we stopped trying to understand who the other person was becoming. Alexander considered this. I think I fell in love with the woman you were at 22, and I tried to keep you in that image instead of growing alongside the woman you were becoming. And I fell in love with the prince who wrote me poetry and brought me wildflowers, Catherine replied. I didn't know how to love the king you're becoming, with all the weight and responsibility that entails. What if we both learned how to love who we are now? Alexander asked quietly. The question hung between them, full of possibility and risk. Catherine looked at her estranged husband, seeing both the young man she had married and the mature father and future king he had become. What would that look like? She asked. I don't know, Alexander admitted. Maybe it would mean starting over completely. Not trying to fix our old marriage, but building something entirely new. Over the following weeks, they began what felt like a careful courtship. Alexander would bring Catherine coffee in the mornings when he came to check on James. Catherine would save Alexander pieces of the children's artwork or funny stories from their day. They began taking evening walks around the manor grounds, talking about everything except whether they were reconciling. The media noticed Alexander's frequent visits to Rosewood Manor, but couldn't quite interpret what they were seeing. Some outlets speculated about reconciliation, others about divorce proceedings. Catherine and Alexander ignored it all, focused on rediscovering each other away from public scrutiny. Emma, perceptive as always, asked her mother directly, Are you and Daddy getting back together? Catherine sat on Emma's bed, choosing her words carefully. Daddy and I are learning to be friends again. We're figuring out how to be the best parents we can be for you and James. But do you love him? Emma pressed. Catherine was quiet for a moment. I think I'm learning to love him differently than I did before. Sometimes love has to grow up too. Alexander began staying at Rosewood Manor more frequently, initially in the guest room, but eventually, tentatively, sharing Catherine's room again. They moved slowly, carefully, both aware that they were building something fragile that could easily break if handled roughly. Their physical relationship resumed gradually, tentatively, with none of the easy familiarity of their marriage but with a new intentionality. They talked more during intimacy than they ever had before, checking in with each other, making sure they were both present, and choosing to be together rather than simply defaulting to marital expectations. This feels different, Catherine said one evening as they lay together in the small bedroom that had become their sanctuary. Different how? Alexander asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her arm. More honest. Less performative. Like we're choosing each other instead of just being stuck with each other. Alexander pulled her closer. I want to keep choosing you if you'll let me. Catherine turned to face him, studying his features in the dim light. What about Victoria? I ended that friendship, Alexander said simply. It wasn't fair to any of us to maintain it. If we're going to try again, we both need to start with clean slates. And if this doesn't work, if we discover that we really have grown too far apart, then we'll have tried with honesty instead of giving up out of fear, Alexander replied. And we'll know we did everything possible before making permanent decisions. As autumn turned to winter, the small family at Rosewood Manor began to feel like a real family again, but different from what they had been before. There was less pressure, more laughter, and an underlying honesty that hadn't existed in their palace life. The children flourished in this new dynamic. Emma's grades improved and she began writing poetry, inspired by watching her parents rediscover their connection through honest communication. James recovered completely from his surgery and seemed more secure, no longer asking when Daddy was coming home because Daddy was simply there. One evening in December, as they decorated a modest Christmas tree in the manor's sitting room, Emma made an observation that stopped both parents in their tracks. You know what's different about our family now? She said, carefully hanging an ornament she had made in art class. What's that, sweetheart? Catherine asked. Before, when we lived at the palace, it felt like we were all acting in a play, like we had to be perfect all the time. Now we just get to be us. Alexander and Catherine exchanged glances over their daughter's head. Out of the mouths of babes, Catherine thought, realizing that their 10-year-old had articulated what they had been struggling to understand for months. That night, after the children were asleep, Catherine and Alexander sat by the fire discussing their future. The separation had been scheduled to last a year, with decisions about their marriage to be made after that time. They were approaching the 9-month mark, and both the royal family and the public were growing impatient for resolution. "The palace is pressuring me to make an announcement," Alexander said. "Either we're reconciling officially, or we need to begin divorce proceedings. The uncertainty is becoming a distraction from royal duties." Catherine stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. "What do you want to do?" "I want to keep doing this," Alexander said, gesturing around the cozy room that had become their haven. "I want to keep learning how to be married to you as the people we are now, not the people we were 15 years ago." "But," Catherine heard the hesitation in his voice, "but I also know that we can't hide here forever. Eventually we have to return to the real world, to palace life, to public scrutiny, and I'm terrified that all the progress we've made will disappear under that pressure." Catherine understood his fear because she shared it. The intimate, honest relationship they had built at Rosewood Manor felt fragile, like a delicate flower that might not survive transplanting to harsher soil. "What if we made different rules this time?" she suggested. "What if we returned to public life but maintained boundaries that protect what we've built here?" "What kind of boundaries?"